we're going to take a look at one of the major results of World War I, and that is the Russian Revolution. And then we'll also look at how kind of the war affects other countries on the home front. And it has major effects throughout the world, but specifically the biggest, most drastic effect, of course, we find in Russia with this full revolution leading to kind of chaos. So we'll start by kind of going back to the beginning. In Imperial Russia, under the Tsar, was really eager to go to this war against Germany. They felt like it was finally a chance to prove themselves, and they saw an opportunity here. Not only were they fighting against Germany, remember, but also against Austria-Hungary. And so the conservatives in the government believed that they could expand into the Balkans, and Russia could expand their influence, gain this route to the Mediterranean, increase their trade, get more power, more land. So that's why conservatives in Russia were really interested in this war. Progressives in Russia were also interested in this war, but for a vastly different reason. They thought this alliance with Britain and France would bring about change. They thought that there was no way that they could continue their kind of authoritarian government system so long as they were engaged in this alliance with really progressive Republican democratic nations. And so they hoped that this alliance, this agreement with Britain and France would help bring change. So everyone was really excited at first to go to war. Despite this, there were a lot of kind of underlying problems in the Russian Empire. The first is, and this affects all empires, nationalism. Specifically in Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Ukraine, and those are all on the kind of western fringes of the Russian Empire, bordering up against Germany. And so there's a lot of nationalist push in those territories. And that makes it difficult then for the Russians to rally support in those regions. Other problems was that Tsar Nicholas II didn't want to give up any power. He viewed Russia as a divine autocracy, with him as the autocrat, him ruling, him having no opposition, no one to suggest anything that he did was wrong. He was in charge, and that's just the way it was going to be. And this didn't work because there was a growing middle and working class that was demanding political change. They saw the changes that had taken place throughout Europe. Remember, this is one of the times when Russia is just lagging behind the rest of Europe. So the rest of Europe, including Germany and Austria-Hungary, had granted at least some rights to their citizens, and there was some voting occurring. In Russia, it was not the case. There was just simply no voice for these people. And although Russia had begun to modernize, they definitely were not fully modernized or industrialized. So they're going to run into the same issues they ran into in the Crimean War, where they can't move troops, they can't supply troops, and they get embarrassed. And it gets a lot worse during World War I than it did during the Crimean War. So we'll take a look at that in a minute. But also the Duma, the middle class, the Duma, remember, is the parliament. The middle class and the lower classes had actually organized to demand a new government. There was demands for representative government and for change. So all of this is festering in Russia as this war breaks out. So although people are excited for the opportunity that this war might give Russia, historians can look back at it and say, yeah, this war doomed the Russian Empire to failure because it, contrary to taking people's minds off domestic problems, it only exacerbated these domestic problems. And that happens really in 1915. And it's in 1915 that Nicholas disbands the Duma, says, okay, Parliament, time for you guys to go. I'm going to rule by myself as an authoritarian leader, totalitarian government. But at the same time he does this, he decides, I need to go lead the war from the front because the war is not going well. And so this is one of those weird moments where he says, I'm taking all power for myself, but I'm not actually going to be here to use that power. And so he goes to the front to lead the war, and it turns out he's a terrible military commander as well as a terrible political commander. So he makes a huge blunder, again, by turning over power of the government to the Tsarina, his wife, who happens to be a German-born princess. So naturally the people of Russia are frustrated with this. They don't like her because she's German and the Russians are supposedly fighting the Germans, so they don't really trust her to have the Russians' best interest at heart. That's one reason why they don't like her. Another reason they don't like her is that she relies very heavily on Grigorii Rasputin as her main advisor, and some argue that he is her lover, And the people of Russia really hate Rasputin. And we'll take a look at him in a minute and analyze why they hate him so much. So this is a problem, right? Nicholas decides he's going to take all the power away from the parliament and give it to himself, but then he leaves and says, just kidding, my wife will take care of all of this. My wife, whom you all hate, and whose main advisor you all hate even more than her. So that's not good. In addition to that, the Russians simply don't have enough supplies. They send soldiers into war without weapons. There are times where they pair up soldiers. The soldier in front has a gun. The soldier behind him has an extra clip of ammunition, and they tell the soldier behind him, okay, you follow the guy in front of you until he dies, and then you pick up his gun, and you reload it with your weapon, and you keep going. So you have soldiers being sent to the front literally unarmed, and they're expected to go fight this war. And so that creates a lot of resentment. They're also unable to move troops very quickly or effectively because they don't have an industrialized or modernized society. In addition, they're defeated very quickly at Tannenbaum and Masurian Lakes, and their army is routed and begins falling apart, in part because Nicholas doesn't know how to lead an army. So you have all sorts of problems facing Russia. And again, I told you we'd come back to Rasputin, so we'll look at this guy. Rasputin is an illiterate peasant from Siberia, and Siberia is kind of the northeastern part of Russia, really inhospitable. Very few people actually live up there. It's where a lot of prisons were put because no one could escape because they'd just go die in the elements. He's considered backward by the people of Russia. He's basically a peasant healer, and he kind of calls on spirits and spirituality in order to heal people. And so people in Russia don't really like him. But he wins the trust of the queen, the Tsarina, because he's able to stop the bleeding of her son, Prince Alexei, who's a hemophiliac, right? And hemophilia is when you're unable to, your blood doesn't clot. And for whatever reason, Rasputin is able to allegedly heal Alexei. And so that makes Alexandra, the Tsarina, believe that he is a miracle worker. And so they demand that, she demands that he stays on as her main advisor. And so he's around. Rasputin opposes a war with Germany, and because of this, many people believe him to be a traitor. So now they look at the Tsarina, who's German, and her main advisor, who doesn't like this war, and they're like, who is this that's leading us? Who is this who's leading our country during war? This isn't going to work. And so we've got this major problem going on. Rasputin also has a reputation for getting a little too close to the wives of the Russian nobility. So we've got that going on. And as a result of that, Rasputin is murdered by the Russian nobility in 1916. And it's a pretty nasty murder where they poison him, he realizes he's been poisoned, they shoot him, and then he actually doesn't die from that, and he starts crawling along, and the people who are there supposed to wait until he actually dies, shoot him again, and he's still not dying, so they kind of beat him, and it's pretty gnarly, but that's Rasputin. So, as a result of all of this pent-up frustration, it eventually boils over. And this starts in February, something called the February Revolution, where a group of workers in Petrograd, which is what one of the main cities is called, they protest because there's inadequate food supplies. And throughout the country, we begin to see in all of these cities, protests because there's no food. And so suddenly this sweeps the country. The Tsarina says, okay, fine, we'll send in the troops to kind of quell these protests and end these rebellions. The problem is when the troops show up, they don't put down the revolution and these revolts. They actually end up joining the revolts. And so now the Tsar and the Tsarina have lost control over their country. And so on March 2nd, Tsar Nicholas steps down. He abdicates his throne. He says, someone else is going to lead this. It's not going to be me. And into this emptiness come two different groups competing for power. One is the Provisional Government, which is the Duma, basically, and the other is the Petrograd Soviet. And Soviets are just groups of people who gather together. So the Petrograd Soviet is in Petrograd, and they are kind of speaking for the people, versus the Provisional Government, which is trying to maintain some order from traditional power structures. And the Provisional Government, while they are running the thing, they are facing some demands from Petrograds, but they do make a few changes. They institute universal suffrage, so people are able to vote. They limit the workdays to 8 hours, and they grant equality for all citizens. So we do see some progress and some modernization. They're trying to maintain the country until an elected assembly could write a new constitution. And all this is this kind of effort to meet the demands of the people that had not been met by the Tsar for years. They promised the redistribution of royal lands and church lands. They're saying, look, the royalty and the church have too much power. We'll redistribute those lands to the poor people so that they're able to work. The guy who leads this provisional government, which truly is a very effective government, is Alexander Kerensky, and he's an agrarian socialist. So he believes in socialism, but he also believes in the benefits of an agrarian society that is based off agriculture. So Kerensky is leading them during this time period. And despite the successes that the provisional government has, they're unable to meet some of the biggest problems that Russia faces. Specifically, the war is dragging on. More and more Russians are dying. And a lot of Russians are dying. The Russians have more dead in this war than anybody else. Just tons of them dying left and right. And there's not enough food to go around from everybody. So those are the two biggest problems. Because they're unable to solve this, the provisional government grows more and more unpopular. And it's a result of this that we really see the radical elements of the Russian Revolution and communism eventually takes hold. And it starts with something called Army Order No. 1. And this is issued by the Petrograd Soviet. And the Petrograd Soviet says all military officers are stripped of their authority. They no longer have the authority that they were given. And instead of there being military officers who have moved up through the ranks, now what they're going to do is they're actually going to vote for officers, and the person who wins that election will will have the authority in that army group. Now, you can imagine that this is not a good idea. Because just because you like somebody does not mean they're going to be an efficient military leader, and just because they can earn votes does not mean they know what they're doing in battle. So, it's this nice idea to democratize the military, but it fails absolutely miserably. And it happens also in part because there's so much frustration within the army. Nicholas had run such a poor military campaign that so many people simply just left. They just walked out of the army and made their way home. They didn't have any weapons. What were they supposed to do? Go fight? So they would leave and walk home. As they were leaving, they would just claim land along the way. And this way they would have a place to settle down. So you have really kind of this chaos going around, and it's kind of problematic. All of this leads to the October Revolution. And this turmoil creates an opportunity for a group called the Bolsheviks, which are the major group in the Petrograd Soviet, to gain control. They are the most radical socialist faction in the Petrograd Soviet. And their leader, Vladimir Lenin, returned from exile in 1917. He had been exiled because of his radical thinking that did not sit well with the Tsar. So he kicked him out of Russia. And if he didn't leave Russia, he probably would have found himself killed pretty quickly. So Vladimir Lenin comes back in 1917. The Petrograd Soviet says, hey, it's a safe environment for you to come back. You can come be our spokesperson. And the Bolsheviks start to gain power. And people like the ideas of Lenin, because Lenin's a great orator. He is a great speaker. He can really rally the troops behind him. And so eventually the Bolsheviks gain power, and they call for an immediate peace with Germany and a complete redistribution of land. This is communism, socialism to the extreme. We redistribute all the land, okay? But because not everyone agreed, we have this massive civil war between two groups, the Reds, which are the Bolsheviks, and the Whites, which is this weird mixture of all sorts of different groups. The Tsarists, those are people who support the Tsar. Socialists, people who want socialism, but not to this level. Liberals, people who wanted more of a kind of a constitutional monarchy, and their allies, which include the United States, Great Britain, and France, who actually send soldiers to fight in this October Revolution. And in this ongoing civil war. And this Russian civil war is nasty. It lasts from 1918, when they sign a separate treaty with Germany to end the war, with Brest-Litovsk, which ends the war, until 1922. Over 3 million people die And one of the major forces behind Bolsheviks, there's really two. One is Vladimir Lenin, who we talked about, and the other is Leon Trotsky, who's the really kind of the intellectual force behind the Bolsheviks. And he helps win the support of the army through his impassioned speeches, through his logic, kind of everything like that. And so the Bolsheviks emphasized kind of key ideas known as war communism, where during the war, complete control over all production and rationing would go to the government, and everything would be distributed equally. And this people liked, because remember, during the war, these people had nothing. They were starving. So the Bolshevik opportunity, they really jumped at. But that doesn't make the Bolsheviks good. And what they do is, the Tsar had always had a secret police for a long time. And instead of doing away with the secret police to kind of bring about prosperity and peace and equality and, I don't know, justice, they end up using the Tsarist secret police for their own aim. And they have their own secret police. And they clamp down on nationalism, where Belarusia, Ukraine, and the Caucasus, any nationalist groups there are brought back into what's now known as the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And so the only country that succeeds from this is Poland, which gains independence from the USSR. So this is a pretty nasty war that drags out, leads to a lot of death and a lot of irritation. The result is that the Bolsheviks and total communism end up taking power and control in what is now known as the Soviet Union. And this is a map that just kind of shows you where all these battles are. And you can kind of see how where the Bolshevik uprisings happen, they're kind of all over the place. And you see that as a result of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, they get rid of a lot of areas. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Finland. Those areas that had nationalist uprisings. All right? Now we'll take a brief look at how World War I changes society. So it's really interesting when World War I starts, people are really eager for this war. They view war still as kind of this glorious battle where people have the opportunity to be heroes, and it's kind of this nice chivalry type deal where soldiers go off triumphantly and they return triumphantly. Unfortunately, that's not the reality of war. War is truly hell, as is experienced in World War I. And World War I is really the first total war that's fought requiring the mobilization of all parts of society in order to support the war effort. Everyone in society needs to contribute to this war effort, whether that's being a soldier, producing goods for a soldier, or working on the home front. So it really transforms society for the 4 years when the war is ongoing, and then actually has greater lasting effects afterwards. For the most part, free market capitalism is abandoned during the duration of the war because the government needs to ration their items and goods. They need to set wage control and price control so that goods don't become too expensive, so that people can continue to buy their food, so that the government can continue to buy gasoline and food and clothes and uniforms. They also limit the movement of workers because they don't want workers moving around to get the highest possible wages. They want workers to stay in the industry they're in and to continue producing, because all parts of this production society are necessary for this war effort to go on. So this really is this abandoning of free market capitalism in order to service the war efforts. One person that really kind of buys into this is a guy by the name of Walter Rathenau, and he's a German industrialist, and he's worth knowing because he sets up something that's kind of modeled throughout the rest of the world called the War Raw Materials Board, where he is in charge of rationing and distributing raw materials throughout Germany. So these clothes suppliers will get this much cotton, these cities will get this much coffee, this much meat, and so he's kind of in charge of running that distribution, which is a huge role for him to play. And one other thing that's really interesting at this time is that the shortage of raw materials leads to a lot of new developments. Specifically in Germany, we see synthetic rubbers developed. Most rubber at this point was imported from Africa, but with the British and French blockade, the Germans were unable to bring it in, but they still needed rubber. So they end up creating synthetic rubbers in order to meet that demand. Food is also rationed in Germany because not enough of it is being produced. And it's not just rationed for the army, but it's rationed for everybody. People would have limits on the amount of meat, sugar, coffee, and other kind of luxury items that they could buy. And really not even luxuries, but flour and eggs as well. And then things begin to get so desperate that in 1916 a law is passed called the Auxiliary Service Law. And this requires that all males between the ages of 17 and 60 work in jobs critical to the war effort. So you're either a soldier, you're producing weapons, or you're transporting troops. You could be making uniforms, but you are directly involved in the war effort. You're not really serving as a lawyer or an accountant, but you are involved in the war effort in some capacity. And that gets back to that idea of total war, of all aspects of society are required to be involved. Within society, there are some pretty major changes. There's increased power and prestige for the labor unions. So although they had been outlawed in a lot of places beforehand, now they start to gain more power and start to get more respect. Women begin to leave home to work in industry because there's a shortage of men. Millions of men are sent to the front lines of these wars and they die. And so there need to be people who can work in these industries. And the men aren't there, so people turn to women and they do the job very well. And because women are doing the job well, it changes the societal attitudes towards them. Because they show that they can do the work of men, suddenly the respect is higher for them. And in part because of their effort and service during the war, women in most countries gain the right to vote right after the war. The men of those countries realize, look, we shouldn't be holding things against them. We should be allowing them full participation, especially considering how much effort they put in during the war. During this time, class distinctions also tend to blur, and the gap between the rich and poor lessen, partly because there's wage limits, there is price limits, and because there's rationing. Just because you're wealthy doesn't mean you get extra food. Yeah, you might be able to buy stuff on the black market, but it costs you a lot of money. And the people who can supply that, generally the poor people, start to close that wealth gap. So we have these really major changes happening across society. In this closing of the wealth gap, you have women becoming more involved. And on top of that, we have the first widespread use of propaganda by governments to force support for their war effort. Despite all of this, war could not hide the domestic problems. It could for a little bit, but eventually they rise up again. In April of 1916, a group of Irish nationalists rise up against the British. That rebellion is crushed within a week, but you have these kind of happening elsewhere. German socialists call for an overhaul of the government, and eventually they get that after the war. Soldiers just get to their breaking point. They suffer shell shock, PTSD, and no one knows how to diagnose this. So it gets to the point where a lot of soldiers simply refuse to fight anymore. They just throw down their weapons and walk away. France becomes on the verge of collapse. During this war, there's strikes, there's journalists speaking out against the war, and then they name a new prime minister, George Clemenceau, who comes in and basically says, look, this is war. You will all support the war. Until the end of the war, there will be no more strikes. You do not have freedom of the press, and so he jails journalists and politicians who are opposed to the war to really put forward a united front in France throughout the duration of the war. So you have these crackdowns at home in order to maintain stability so that governments can focus abroad. So those are some of the major changes that we have. Of course, the most radical of these changes is the revolution in Russia, but these tinges of revolution touch all countries during this time.